I came into the production of Avatar, I guess about halfway through live action. So it was interesting to kind of jump into the middle of this very evolved, very long process.
I don't really know what it is, but it's something.
When Deb Scott came in, she actually fabricated every single article of clothing that every single virtual character in the movie wore, as if it was going to be photographed. And in fact, it was then photographed and scanned and so on to act as a guide for what the CG version of that would look like.
Jim was very specific about what he felt the environment might have been like at that point. I think he had obviously very specific ideas about the culture of the people, and then sort of trying to spring off from there to what that meant to what the people wore. Along that way, I think it was a little bit of a learning experience for everyone to really try to figure out what the place of the costume designer might be.
Your creative process doesn't change. It's exactly the same as making costumes for a live-action movie.
I think Jim realized very quickly that he actually needed to have a much more kind of hands-on, very realistic approach to the costumes.
So it all had to be designed on paper. It had to be imagined. It had to be drawn. It had to be physically fabricated, hand-stitched, hand-woven. Then we looked at it, we lit it, we looked at it, physically looked at it. Then we said, okay, now send it to Weta.
We were trying to invent something which no one had ever seen before. So we kept making stuff and making stuff. Now, we could have just done a drawing and given that to Weta Digital, but they'd go, but how does it hang? What weight, you know? How does it move in the wind? That sort of information that you can't expect a technician in front of a computer screen digitally creating it to have to think about.
I think it was of great help to Weta to have physical pieces in hand. And I think through the process of the film, we all learned that that was the best way to get the most complete, beautiful rendering of a garment.
What Jim wanted to portray in the Na'vi people is actually a tribal look that was unique, but yet tribal and soft and beautiful, organic, reflecting the kind of philosophy that the Na'vi people live, which is very utopic and happy. We look all the major ethnic tribal parts of the world, Africa, Mexico, Mesoamerica, Indonesia, Maori, many tribal parts of the world.
What we tried to do with the costumes is that if you look at these pieces, and maybe it's only a tiny little neckband or a single strand of something, but when you look at each thing, they are so intricately woven. There's leather and fiber and seeds and beadings and pine cone pieces and all sorts of things like put together to make a very, very complex object.
You can't go straight from imagination to CG. It won't look real. You have to make a physical thing.
It's the same thing that I thought when I saw the film. It's what I tried to do with my part of the costumes, was to take a piece and want to go inside of it and see the story that it told. Collaborating with Jim Cameron is actually an amazing experience, and I say that with, you know, just such respect for him, because he has the ability to keep an entire movie and a visual movie in his mind. So he's got this incredible story going on, and you're just lucky to be there and get your little chapter of it. So it was gratifying to see that the work and the time that you put into something would be so real and so respected. It was an amazing experience for all of us, for everybody.
Avatar is about trying to learn the other culture, trying to learn their language, trying to push through into an understanding of their worldview. And of course, the first key to that is always language, you know, because people think in their own language, and their language is a reflection of their worldview.
Nari. 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 Nari.
Now, I had done some of that stuff before I ever met with a linguist. I was just basing it on my sort of, you know, casual acquaintance with some Polynesian languages, some other languages that had these kind of various, you know, symbols and indicators for pronunciation. So I wrote, you know, I wrote it as N-A-apostrophe-V-I so that it wouldn't be Navi or Navi. It's not V.
And I think he did it because it's not something that is conventional to our English language.
It was just a way of trying to indicate that there is some detail to this language.
And so it's What brought me to the movie is an email that was forwarded to me where they were looking for someone to create a language for a James Cameron movie.
So then when I started working with Dr. Paul Frommer, he got excited by that. He said, what does this apostrophe mean to you? I said, well, it's just the way you pronounce that word. He said, okay, let's work with that and we'll incorporate that into it. And then he went miles and miles beyond those initial ideas.
He wanted it to be an interesting language, and he showed me some of the words that he had come up with. And that gave me a sense of the kind of sounds he had in mind. So at that point, I went home and devised what I call sort of a sound palette. These were essentially various permutations of different sounds.
He called it the sound system. And he'd constantly sending me these MP3 files where he's pronouncing these weird words.
It's but it just gave him a sense of some of the possibilities that I've been thinking about for the sounds. And after that, it was a question of deciding on the structural properties of the language.
He spent the first few months just figuring out what the order of verb, subject, object would be. And it actually winds up being, in Navi, they speak the same order as German, which is I to the store go. Navi doesn't sound like German, but he created a structure.
It was something that took work and something that I never would have thought of because it had to make sense in the larger context.
All the lines that were to be spoken in Navi first appeared in English. And then it was up to me to turn that into Navi. So it was once I had the elements of the language in place, it was pretty much a translation exercise. Except that I didn't have a dictionary. I was the one who created the dictionary, so of course I had to create the words as well as put them together into sentences.
You should see the amount of Navi we made up yesterday.
Oh, wonderful.
In your absence.
That
Paragraphs. It was like Shakespeare. These guys were just going off.
Okay. He wanted it to be something that didn't sound like anything that we've ever heard before, but also that sounded like something that was doable in the sense that the actors could master it and make it their own so that they could actually act in it.
We had a phenomenal woman named Carla Meyer working with us as our dialect coach.
I guess typically the job of a dialect coach is to work with the actors when they're speaking English, but here she had to do two things. She had to work with the actors in English and also in Navi.
What we've done is we've really worked on it as a company of actors. And what we've been doing in the last couple of weeks is having them speak their way of speaking Navi to each other so that there's a bleed, so that Zoe picks up a little bit of Laz's sound and Laz can pick up a little bit of Cece's sound, so that we're artificially creating that melting pot. John's suggestion, which was very smart, was to have Zoe and Laz come up and just do a little bit of the dialogue so that Wes could hear what we've established, so that rhythmically and so on he can kind of match up, and he's doing great.
Ei tu kanur piveng, ai wespe es soli ketu mongo guru.
Fishurete ngal balloon malung fish pitsing.
The Navi is really cool, and when you hear the Navi actually speaking to each other in Navi, it blows your mind.
Fishurete ngal balloon malung pitsing.
The problem was that nobody spoke Navi. So the question is, what were we going to establish, and then how was everyone else going to meet that criterion? So I basically said, Zoe, you get to establish what Navi sounds like and what the Navi accent sounds like, because you're the one with the most lines. And then everybody else is just going to have to try to match you as best they can.
Let me hear this line as written in Navi.
With any accent, you have to feel that it's not a hindrance. It's, you know, it's part of your costume. It's part of who you become.
So, you know, clearly what we were doing is we were trying to match a standard that Paul Frommer had created. But to the extent that the accent was really up for grabs. Paul was creating a language. He wasn't creating an accent.
It's very hard because how do I speak English with an accent? I barely speak English all in itself.
So we had to come up with a brand new accent that nobody had ever heard before, and yet it had to be something that she could act her entire part in.
To me, it's been the most challenging thing, is to speak English with a Navi accent.
Well, this is your fault. They did not need to die.
My fault. They attacked me. How am I the bad guy?
Your fault!
Hey, woo.
Your fault!
Jim's vision of Pandora was mind-boggling. Just meeting with him and then presenting things to him and getting his reactions back were very encouraging. And so building on what he had come up with originally and then hearing his responses to things that I had come up with really allowed me to go, I think, in a direction that's worked out pretty well.
In the conversations with John Landau and Jim Cameron, it was clear that they wanted Pandora to follow the natural laws of biology and physics that we have on Earth and to really be as realistic as it could be, as though one had gone to another planet and found life that followed the same sort of first principles we would find here on Earth. On Pandora, or anywhere, the environmental factors that would have the most influence on plants would be the light, the solar radiation, which is needed for photosynthesis, the gases in the air, carbon dioxide certainly, which is needed for photosynthesis. Since plants respond to gravity, plants have means of determining which way is up and which way is down, so they can detect gravity. So on Pandora, there's a very strong magnetic field and very weak gravity, so plants were able to grow much larger. So gigantism, the large trees, the large plants.
That is one big damn tree.
On Pandora, it was really clear in the movie that all the animals were able to communicate in some way with each other, and it appeared that they could communicate with the plants as well. One of the things that I suggested that was incorporated into the movie was this idea of signal transduction, which on Earth we know is how plant cells communicate with each other.
Amazing, isn't it? So that is signal transduction, some kind of electrochemical communication between the roots of the trees, like the synapses between neurons.
Well, Sigourney loves preparation, and she loves to really absorb everything she can about a character. And of course, her character is a botanist. She's a scientist. So Sigourney consulted with a botanist when we went to Hawaii, and she learned about sampling. She learned about the taking of notes in the field and how you take samples and how you keep them uncontaminated and so on. So we made up a little sample kit of instruments for her, and she went out into the forest and she started to think like a botanist. She started to look at the world as a scientist looks at the world. And it's so great when actors can ground a performance in some sense of reality.
This is a strawberry guava?
Yes, it is.
Well, you learn a lot in an afternoon, don't you?
We went to Hawaii because Jim wanted us to experience a real rainforest. So we went to Kauai, and we had 3 days in the rainforest. And it was very useful taking samples. There was a Hawaiian botanist there showing me and Joel how to take samples. And it showed me how stressed the landscape is by the mining and by the clear cutting, because it's almost as if this rainforest is one complete organism.
The wealth of this world isn't in the ground, it's all around us.
Avatar obviously has a strong environmental message and a conservation message, which is very near and dear to my heart as well. I'm a very passionate botanist. I've spent my career as a botanist. The message in Avatar of conservation and living in harmony with nature is one that I think resonated with many, many people, many viewers of the movie. People just thought it was a very lovely story and a very strong message that one should take seriously. In addition to promoting the idea of living in harmony with nature and conserving the environment, Avatar has done something for botany that I think no other movie has ever done. And what I hope is that this just continues to be something people think about and revel in, because all of the blockbuster status and the 3D technology aside, this movie has done probably more for conservation of biodiversity of plants